All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I want to do a quick overview of the animation tool and show you guys some really useful tips and tricks. The reason I want to do this is because I've been getting a lot of questions lately, and in some cases, people are just not familiar enough with the tool. In other cases, they're finding inconsistencies that they're trying to work around, and in some cases, they're just trying to create functionality that, or ask for it, that doesn't yet exist. So the thing about the animation tool is it is capable of enormous subtlety, not very fancy. You can't move the camera in every direction. You can roll the camera, you can turn the camera this way. You can change the pitch this way. You can't roll the camera that way. But aside from that, the camera tool in Enscape, the animation tool, is capable of really extraordinary subtlety. So I want to approach this from the standpoint that when you're creating an animation in Enscape, there's some expectations. You want to be able to work very elegantly. You want to just be able to find things. You want to be able to work very predictably so that if you make a change, you want to make sure that change is accepted. And you need to work very efficiently. You need to be able to do things quickly, appropriately quickly. And a big part of that is getting ready for post-production. There's very few times where you just create an animation out of Enscape and send it directly to the customer. I like using Camtasia for post-production, but effectively you want to get that animation started and set up as quickly as possible, even if you render it, because you can render it and then begin to set up what you need in post-production very quickly. And then when you come back and get everything verified, you can re-export the animation at a very high quality and then just swap that out in the post-production process. So the first thing we're going to look at is actually opening the animation tool. I've got a Revit project open here in the background. This is should be kind of familiar. It's evolved over the last 6 years or so working with the Enscape team. And so this is our little vignette. And we're going to open the animation tool with this little button right here. This will open up the video editor. And as you see, you can also press the V key. So I'm just going to click on this option. And at the moment, we don't have any keyframes set up. So you can place keyframes. You've got two options. You can either use the plus symbol here to place keyframes. You can also press the K key, and that's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to, for this initial instance, I'm going to press or create keyframes using the K key. As we add these keyframes, we're going to go back and modify them. And here's the overall scenario. I would argue that you don't want to create individual animation paths, export them individually, and then have to go through the process of loading them and rendering them individually. So let's say you've got a dozen animation paths and they're each going to be about 10 seconds long. It will take no time to render that as an entire sequence, but if you have to keep opening, rendering, closing, importing, rendering, closing, it's that time between your animations that often takes time. So we're going to create a scenario where we're going to create a continuous cut animation. It's going to go from one sequence, it's going to jump to the next sequence, and we're going to be able to animate multiple sequences all at the same time. So the first thing we're going to do is add keyframes. And to do that, we'll just add the first one. It's all done in first person mode, which is a little bit different than adding keyframes in Revit. So we go to, let's say for this initial sequence, we're going to kind of start up high at the left and we're going to move down low to the right. That's going to be our sequence. And we're going to do that initially with 3 cameras. So I'm going to start up here. Let me just move up a little bit and maybe point the camera down. So let's say we'll start out here and we'll create a camera. We can do that with this little plus symbol, okay? Then I'm going to start to move down. This is going to be our second location, and I'll place another camera, but this time I'll do it with a K key. And we're still in first person mode. It's not like in Revit where we're in third person mode. And this is going to be our third camera, okay? I'll just press the K key again. And if you can see along the timeline here, you can see that we've got 3 cameras along this timeline. And those 3 cameras can be selected by individually picking on the triangle that represents or the sort of geographic shape that represents the camera. So here we are at the 3rd keyframe. We can jump back to the 2nd keyframe. We can jump back to the 1st keyframe. We can also advance through them with this option to jump to the next or previous keyframe, which is this one. So here's the next keyframe and the next keyframe. So this is our first sequence. Okay. I want to jump. So that's just the process of just adding keyframes. When we add these keyframes, you can also go back and we're going to focus on the timestamp tool. So the timestamp tool allows you to explicitly determine how long it takes to get from one keyframe to the next. So at the moment, if we look at this second keyframe, it's at 7 seconds. And if we look at the last keyframe, it's at 13 seconds. So let's go back and modify those. So I'm going to jump back to the previous keyframe and select the timestamp option. And we're going to change this value to 5 seconds. And then we're going to update it. And then we're going to get to the last keyframe. I'm going to jump ahead to the next one. And you'll notice that the timestamp function is faded here. You can't actually get to it. The only way you can get to it is actually to leave the sequence and then modify the overall duration. So I'm just going to press the escape key once. That's one way to leave this first person mode. You can also select this little icon that says exit keyframe, and we're going to set the total duration to 10 seconds. Okay, and then we're going to go back to the first keyframe, the second keyframe, and the third keyframe. Okay, so that's this is the first part of the animation path. But the other thing that happens when you create these animations, if we play this sequence right now, which is about 10 seconds long, let's go to the first camera and hit the play button. It's just going to transition from one keyframe to the second keyframe to the third keyframe over 10 seconds. And if you've ever had to jump into post-production and edit video, you know that you don't just want to immediately jump into movement. You want a kind of a period of rest from one camera to just sit there for a little bit and then start the sequence. And maybe when you get to the end of that sequence, you want to rest. So how do we do that inside of Enscape? Because if we're creating one continuous cut, we don't want cameras just starting at the beginning of the sequence. We need some time to kind of let it sit there and fade in. So the way to do that is we can jump back to the first camera, and then there's this option to add another camera. Okay, so we're right here on the first camera. I'm going to add another keyframe from this location, and this location is on top of the first camera. Okay, and then you can see these triangles have just doubled up on top of each other here. And now we're going to jump to the third keyframe. So now we're inside of the second keyframe, and we're going to jump. Let me just save that. We're going to jump to the next keyframe. We're going to jump to the next keyframe, and we realize we really want another camera here. Okay, and that's going to help us to create a period of rest at the end of this first sequence. So I'm going to press the K key, and that's just created another keyframe, or we can press this plus button here, which is going to create another keyframe. You can see the triangles have just changed. So what happens when we go back to the beginning of the sequence? Well, I'm going to go back right here to the very beginning, and we can see that the sequence obviously starts at 0 seconds. Then we're going to jump to the next camera, and we're going to turn on the timestamp, and we're going to say, why is it doing that? This is one of those idiosyncrasies. At the moment when the keyframes are right on top of each other, or sometimes you'll get this situation where you're just on top of the timestamp and you can't get in to that time box fast enough. So just move, if you can move in quickly and click, it'll be okay. So we're going to set this second keyframe to 5 seconds, okay? And then we're going to select update. So between the first keyframe and the second keyframe, it should be 5 seconds. And I've noticed that sometimes it does tend to jump around. We're going to fix that in a moment as well. So we've updated that. Now we're going to jump to the next keyframe and realize, well, if we wanted to push that down between the first and the second and the third, we really wanted 10 seconds. So this is where having those timestamps is going to help you, but you still will get anomalies. And I'll show you that in a moment. So here's the third camera. And then we're going to go to the fourth camera and add a timestamp. So the previous one is at 10 seconds. We want this one to be at 15 seconds and update. And then, as I mentioned, we can't get to the last camera. I'll show you a workaround for that in a moment. But if we leave the whole sequence, then we can set the duration to 20 seconds. Okay, and then we'll go back to the first keyframe. Now here's what I've discovered. Sometimes when you edit that total length, it sometimes makes your keyframes inside move around, even though you've checked the timestamp button and given it a very specific time. So here we are on the first one. It's at 0, the next one's 5, the next one's 10, the next one's 15, and then we're at rest until 20. So actually this time it worked out. I have found in some situations, if we change the total duration, it goes back and it will kind of proportionally adjust the other keyframes. So this is our first sequence. Okay, we've got that figured out. I'm going to leave these keyframes and start the next sequence. But before we start the next sequence, I want to show you how to very carefully and explicitly control the Enscape camera. So we're going to go back to Revit, and we're going to go to the Enscape tab, and we're going to go to the general settings. And there's an option under Revit, because this is a unique kind of feature for Revit, that allows you to enable the live Revit camera from Enscape inside of Revit. I'm going to click on this option. It closes the window. And then I'm just going to pan around a little bit, and we can actually see where the Enscape camera is over here. I'm going to zoom into it. So the challenge that I find with the Enscape camera is by itself, this is really what you see in 2D and 3D. So it's not very obvious when you're moving around a plan view. So here's what I've done to the Enscape camera. And there's a tutorial on LinkedIn to do this. It's not very hard. What we're basically going to do is give this camera, we're going to give the camera more visual presence so that we can tell where it is. Instead of it just being a visible in 3D and a very small object, we're going to turn all of the geometry off so that it doesn't show up in a plan view. And then when we look at the camera in a plan view, we're going to create a detail, filled region, or a detail region that represents this camera and the direction of the camera. That's really important if you want to be able to tell which way the camera is pointing. The other thing we've modified about this camera is we placed a reference line in the camera. This is a generic object. Whenever the generic object crosses the cut plane in Revit, it will display. But if this camera is above a certain height, it's going to stop displaying in Revit, which we don't want. So this reference line is a bit of a hack to get the camera to show up in a plan view as long as the family is being cut, and this reference line is about 3 meters long. So that means even if the camera is up quite high, that line is going to intersect the cut plane, which is going to make the camera visible. So I'm going to close this family, and we're going to look at the Revit project in a plan view. And we can see this icon over here. This is the Enscape camera. And if we go back to Enscape and actually navigate to a different location, we'll be able to go back to Revit and see the camera here. So this is a great thing about the Enscape camera, is you can use the Enscape camera to control the location of your keyframes very, very carefully. Okay, so if I click away for a moment and then select the camera, we can see that it has an elevation value, it has a pitch value, and it also has a rotation value. So let's say we want to do a very careful sequence that pans from the left side of this scene, and it's going to pan across that little seating area, and then it's going to end up on the from right to left side of the scene. If you're doing this in Enscape, you might think that you get it lined up exactly, but then you go back to Revit and we can see that this camera is actually pitching almost negative 4 degrees. So it's pitching down. If it's a positive value, it's up. And if it's 0, it's going to be looking straight ahead. It's also not exactly aligned with the scene. So the nice thing about the Enscape camera in Revit is we can use something like the Align tool in Revit. I'm going to click here and here. You can align it in this direction, and we can also align it in this direction. So now we know that the camera in Enscape is at a very specific location, and we can also set its elevation and its angle. So we can set the elevation value to an explicit 3 feet, and we can also set the pitch value to 0. And then we'll go back to Enscape and see what this looks like. And this is our starting view. So at this point, with the animation tool turned back on, we can go to the very last camera, and we have this option to create another keyframe. We're going to create a keyframe from this location, and then we're going to go back to Revit, and we're going to use the Align tool and select this edge and then the Enscape camera. It's going to move the camera over, and then we can now use that location to select the last keyframe. So I hope that's a good tip for you guys. I heard somebody say, ooh. This is the only way I know to get very careful camera control in Enscape. And you've probably seen the examples of Fin Hua and some other people that have these very beautiful, very careful pans of the camera. And that's a hard thing to do in Enscape if you're trying to estimate where is the camera pointing, what is the camera's elevation, and what is the camera's orientation. Okay. Now for this sequence, we also need to have a camera at the beginning of this sequence because we want it to rest for 5 seconds, and we want another camera at the end. So we're going to go back to the previous camera, and I'm going to use this option here for previous keyframe. Let's jump to the beginning. So we'll just click through one. There's the middle one. Here we are. We're resting. We jump to the next one. We set the timestamp. And we're also, well, we'll go ahead and update that. And then we'll place another keyframe inside of this camera. So we don't want to hit this end button. We want to hit it between the two existing cameras. That's just put another keyframe there. Okay, and then we want to select that keyframe. Let me go back one. So we're here. That's the first one. This is the second one. We want to make sure we have the timestamp set for that. And this is where it starts getting flicky again. So I'm going to set this last timestamp for a couple of seconds and update it. And then we're going to jump to the last camera. So it's going to pause here and then jump to the next one. And we're going to place one more camera. We could do that at the end. We might as well set the timestamp, but we can't do that. And this is what I'm going to show you guys how to fix in a moment. So I'm going to select this. Now we've got a camera here. I'm just going to go back to the previous keyframe. So we're here and one more, and we'll give the next to the last keyframe a timestamp. We'll make sure to update it. We'll jump to the last keyframe, and we can see that the total duration is 36 seconds. So this is the part where if we go back to the very beginning, that was supposed to be, that moment of rest was supposed to be 5 seconds. And then we're jumping to the next camera with 5 more seconds. So as you can see, the sequence has proportionally grown for some reason. The other thing is you can't modify the final timestamp, which would be really, really convenient. So here's how we're going to do this. So we can actually use this technique to modify all of the keyframes at once, and we're going to create a jump cut between the end of the first sequence and the beginning of the second sequence. Okay, just bring up my cheat sheet here. All right, so here's how we're going to do it. We're going to start by exporting this video path. So we're going to say save path to file, and I'm just going to place it right here on the desktop. It's an XML file. And then I'm going to close all the windows temporarily and right click on this XML file. And we'll just open it with something like Notepad. That's what I like to use. It's not the most obvious, but because it doesn't have your different values color coded. So here's our keyframe. Here's all the keyframes. The first camera is called 0 in the keyframe in the XML editor. Don't know why. You'll just have to do the mental math. But here's how we can modify this. And then we notice that the last keyframe does not have a timestamp. Well, you can add one through this XML editor. So here, this last camera is number 8, and there's no timestamp. We're just going to take the rest of this value and copy it. And then we're going to put it in here and paste it. Okay, so that's the timestamp for the last camera. And just to make sure I've got the formatting right. Okay, so we're at the first camera. That's obviously at 0 seconds, so we don't need a timestamp for that. We get to the second camera, which is frame order number 1, and we see it's 6.7. Like it's down to the 10,000ths of a second. We don't need that. We're just going to take this and say, okay, we're going to rest for a period of 5 seconds. So we're going to save this or change this to 5. All right. From the end of that second camera to the next camera, we want 5 seconds to transition and then another 5 seconds. So we're going to take this value and make it 10. Then we're going to get to the next one and make it 15. And then where that camera is right on top of that other camera, and it doesn't look like I've got a frame order here, I'm just going to grab this value and Control-C to copy it and Control-V to paste. So from the first resting for 5 seconds, that's to the camera that's in the middle, to the last camera 5 seconds, and then resting for 5 more seconds. So that's going to get us at 20. Okay, now we want to do a jump cut from the end of the first sequence, that end resting camera, to the beginning of the next sequence. And Enscape will allow you to set a timestamp down to 1/100th of a second. So we can effectively, instead of rendering 5 seconds to get to the next camera, the next camera is going to jump to that location in 20.01 seconds. That's going to be the 100th of a second jump. So it doesn't have to render practically any frames. Then we're going to rest for 5 seconds. So that's going to set us at 25. I mean, you could get technical and say 25.01, but I just do it in round numbers. And then we're going to go to the last camera in 5 seconds. So we're going to do that pan across that seating area. And we're going to say that one's at 30 seconds. Right? And we can just use whole numbers. And then we're going to rest for 5 seconds. And we have a timestamp. So that's going to be at 35. I'm going to save this sequence. And without closing the other sequence, we can simply reload this one and it will override it. So here's Enscape. And I've had this happen before. For some reason with Zoom, I'm going to have to open the window from here and open Revit from here and then go back to Enscape. So now we're going to select this video path drop-down option to load a path from file. We're going to select the animation path. We haven't even closed it. We simply saved it to make sure the changes were there. And when we click on it, you should be able to see that all of these sequences, all of these cameras have come in at the right relative location. Even the timeline is updated. So here we are at the first camera. We're resting for 5 seconds. We transition to the second camera over 5 seconds, to the next camera at 5 seconds, and then it looks like we're resting. Then we jump to the next camera and rest. 5 seconds, we jump to the end, and that should be our final point of rest. So I'm just going to go ahead and play this. As a matter of fact, I would expect to see another option here. When we get to the end of this sequence, notice how the timestamp is checked. That's at the very last sequence. The timestamp now shows up. We can't click on it, but we were able to activate it by adding that little line of code in the XML file. I'm just going to go back 5 seconds. Wait for here, 5 seconds, jump to the previous camera, 5 seconds of rest, derp, derp, derp. These two cameras that look like they're right on top of each other, that's not at the same location. That is the jump cut between the two sequences. So I just want you to see these one more time. 5 seconds of rest, middle camera, last camera, 5 seconds of rest, jump cut to the next camera, 5 seconds of rest, transition to the last camera, and rest for 5 seconds. All right, now we're going to preview this. So let me jump to the first camera, and we're going to allow this to play through. So it's resting for 5 seconds. That's all it's doing. And then it's going to start to transition 5 seconds to the next camera. And I wish it would show these on a timeline. Where are we relative to this sequence? And then we're going to get to the last camera, and it's going to rest for 5 seconds. Then it's going to do the jump cut to the beginning of the next sequence, rest for 5 seconds, transition to the last camera, rest for 5 seconds. And the beauty of this is, even if you've created multiple animation paths, you go, oh, I wish I'd known this before because I could have created one long animation path. Well, if you've got your XML files, if you export them individually, you can actually copy and paste, just create one new master XML file, and you can create one long camera sequence. You'll just have to go back and rename or renumber the keyframes because they start with 0, and obviously each sequence is going to start with 0, so you have to modify that. And then you'll have to modify the timestamp individually for the cameras so that they make sense. So what we have done in less than 30 minutes is we've shown how to place keyframes, to create moments of rest between keyframes, to explicitly control the Enscape camera from Revit, to then create, to export the XML file in order to create jump cuts between individual sequences so that when we render, we don't have to open and close them manually and wait for each sequence to render. It's not interesting. We can just do it all as one sequence. And the point of that is being able to give it to somebody quickly to go into post-production so they can get all their transitions and things set up. And then if the design changes, it doesn't matter. You just open up the whole sequence, press the the render button for the animation, and then swap that out, kind of like a reference file. You swap it out in the background in your animation editing software, and that will allow you to create the animation pretty quickly and easily then in post-production. So that's it. I'm not going to stop the share yet, but I can open it up for questions, or I can look at the chat window and see if there's any options there. Let's see. I don't want to stop the share to do this. Are there any questions so far? You guys can actually, you can unmute each other and ask, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question if you have any.
Sorry, I think I missed how you exported the TXT file to
Yeah,
the.
good. It's an XML file. You just select this option in the video next to where it says video path. There are these 3 bars. You click on those 3 bars and you have the option to save a path to file, load a path from file, or start a new path. So what I did was I got everything kind of set up, and the timestamps were a little wonky, but we saved the path to a file, opened it up in Notepad, and then modified the timestamps, and then loaded it back into the project.
That's cool. I've done that multiple times, but I didn't know, I've never opened it up. So that's cool.
There you go. Glad to help, Michael. Thanks, bud. Any other questions? Okay, well, I hope this was useful. What I'll do is save this project, and I'm going to take everything in this file, all the materials, there's actually animations. I'm going to take the XML file that's been created. I'm going to put it in a folder and put it on Dropbox, and as well as a link to this video. If you guys have any questions, any follow-up questions you're too embarrassed to ask in the moment, just send me an email and we'll keep it quiet. So thank you very much, everyone. Hope you have a great day. Have a great weekend. And thank you for letting me support your use of Enscape. Please reach out anytime you have any questions. Bye.